gentlemen. Right, some housekeeping. One, thanks to the unique way that the department is structured, what we don't have is a register sheet for today, so please print and sign. Another thing from a friend of mine in the Students' Union. It is student-led teaching awards, where you guys get to nominate teachers or lecturers or members of the support staff that you have found unusually helpful, inspiring, innovative, etc., etc. And they go forward for consideration, and then if you're really, really lucky, what will happen is that that particular member of staff will get some kind of prize from the Student Union. Ideally not a slap in the head. So, nominations close tomorrow, at close of business 5 o'clock. You can nominate via forms in the union, or you can also nominate online at the Student Union website. If you want to. This is by no means compulsory, it's just that they really want to get lots of engagement going, so it'd be fab if you guys could sort of think about it. And if there's someone you particularly like, admire, or has made a direct impact on your education, no matter whether it's from a lecturer's perspective, from a tutorial leader's perspective, or indeed from a support member's perspective, then now's your chance to say thank you. And it means a lot to the people who get the awards. It means a huge amount to people who get the nominations as well. So that would be fantastic. So, we are talking today about what some call the Second Gulf War, some call the Iraq invasion, others call the War of Western Aggression, the oil war. However, its official designation was, of course, Operation Iraqi Freedom. This was a coalition of forces coming together to depose a dictator. But we need to try and unpack this. We need to try and work out how the hell this happened. We could subtitle this, or How I Learned to Love Neoconservatives. These guys, the neoconservatives, have a direct impact on the run-up to Operation Iraqi Freedom and the decisions made prior to and during the war. However, I think we are probably doing everybody else and the rest of the international community a bit of a disservice if we say it was all a neoconservative project. But that's not to say that they weren't useful, or more importantly, that they weren't influential in the decision-making process that happened prior to the invasion of Iraq. I'm kind of hoping there's some sound. This is footage. It was taken from the Al Rashid Hotel in Baghdad, and it's just rushed through. We'll have another go with that. You won't be able to get the noise, unfortunately. But this was taken on basically the second night of the bombardment of Baghdad. If anybody particularly wants to see it fully, you can find it quite easily on YouTube. In the background you can see anti-aircraft fire. You can hear small arms fire from the ground. You can also see the arrival of American cruise missiles. And from my rather bad laptop sound, you can hear the wailing of sirens. Looks pretty indiscriminate, doesn't it? And this is just a camera on a balcony in a hotel. And you can see all these explosions and you can hear all this shooting and firing. This is actually a remarkably targeted operation. A combination of cruise missiles and F-117s are using directly targeted munitions against command and control. They're picking out the important bits. But people are dying. And there's a whole bunch of reasons why people are dying. And it's unfortunate that they are dying. And to get to some of these reasons why people are dying, we must accept that this is certainly, to an extent, a war of acronyms. This one features prominently. If you look at some of the reportage from, for example, inside the Green Zone, the World Trade Center appears on murals, and it is regarded by certain members of the occupying forces as being the raison d'etre for the American forces being in Iraq. Whether there's a direct causal link or not sure. Certainly, as we'll explore, it had an effect, and it changed something while we were going through that period of change in the international community in the immediate aftermath of the World Trade Center attacks. Here's another W which is going to appear. WMD. Someone, anyone, just give me a quick definition of WMD. What is it? Weapon of mass destruction. Okay, everyone hear that? Right? And we kind of lump a whole bunch of different weapons into that category. So we have nuclear weapons, but we have gas, we have biological weapons, or unconventional weapons. Because they kill people in ways that maybe we can't easily and readily understand. But I think when it comes to this particular war, there is one acronym which actually forms a question, which is possibly the one which we should address first. And it's this one. WTF. To speak in the vernacular, what the fuck happened? How did we end up here? How did we, as rational, enlightened beings, end up invading a largish country in the Middle East? Is it to do with WTC? Is it to do with WMD? Is it to do with something else completely different? I think this is a valid question. And I think it's a question that we should all actually embrace every so often, because as theorists, as historians, as strategic theorists, what we're interested in is explaining stuff. And once we can explain stuff, we can then kind of perhaps maybe, if we're lucky, predict stuff. What the hell? So we are now into the realm of war and politics. Any Clausewitz teams in the room? Raise your hands. Anyone read Clausewitz? So at least one of you will recognize this. It's the hoary old Clausewitz quote which gets dragged out by every IR theorist. But they don't necessarily always understand it. War is a continuation of politics by other means. It indicates to us, of course, that war is a temporary state. It indicates, of course, to us that politics precedes war, and that war precedes politics. Therefore, to study a war in isolation of what came before it is to fundamentally do ourselves a disservice. In the case of this particular war, we cannot avoid having to ask this question: what came before? It also reminds us, of course, that there are a variety of other things that we need to bear in mind. That wars come in flavours. Their character changes. And their character is directly affected according to the political environment in which they are being fought. Because the political environment defines the belligerents. The political environment defines what kind of politics is going to come after this war. Therefore, we have a responsibility as fighters of wars to both bear in mind the politics that comes before and the politics that comes after. Bear that in mind. So I'm going to posit something that actually this war is fundamentally based on unfinished business. And that we should probably run back and have a quick look at the First Gulf War to understand the second. Now, the First Gulf War is relatively straightforward. Essentially, Iraq invaded Kuwait. Iraq regarded Kuwait as being completely incompatible with Iraq's grand strategic goals. But why? I mean, we can look at 1920. I mean, that's when the borders were established. We can look at 1932 and Iraq's independence. We could look at 1958 and the overthrow of the Iraqi monarchy. We could go to 1961, the independence of Kuwait from Britain. We could go to 1968 and the rise of Baathism in Iraq. We could go to 1979 and the emergence of Saddam Hussein himself. We could do all of these if we choose to. Because what we're looking at is a continuum of politics, which inevitably leads to war. However, I would suggest that actually, when we're talking about this war, the Operation Iraqi Freedom, what we're actually dealing with is the end of the last war. And here we can see this war traced out in law, essentially. So we have 660. This is the Security Council reacting to the invasion of Kuwait. WTF. We bounce on a bit and we head to 678, which is, dude, we're coming. It's authorization of coalition forces to remove Iraq from Kuwait. It's the go order. And from Operation Desert Shield, it becomes Operation Desert Storm. Remarkably quickly, Iraq leaves Kuwait. And so we end up at 686, issued on the 2nd of March, 1991. And this is beginning to set out the terms of the peace. We can think of victory because I would suggest that for the coalition, the experience that they had in Kuwait was very much a victory. And if we accept that victory is the right to determine the peace, this is the international community beginning to determine the peace. And 686 is really, really important because there are two things that it does. It begins to introduce questions of WMD. It states in the text quite explicitly that Iraq must give up these weapons. It also spells out Iraq's international and domestic obligations. And perhaps most importantly, what happens is it puts the brake on coalition forces. And at this point, they've got the bit between their teeth. They're willing to go. They're ready to go to Baghdad. In fact, the Americans are pretty much halfway there. And they said, no, stop. But it leaves some unfinished business. because it reminds Iraq of its international obligations. It reminds Iraq of the WMD question and says, no, stop. But what happens is that Iraq doesn't really engage, or doesn't seem to engage, or perhaps we don't want to believe that it's engaging because we don't trust him. And we don't trust him because, for example, we look at how the Iraqi society is structured, how it's cliental. How many of you here know a local councillor? Put your hand up. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. So that's 12 of you who would probably be able to go to university in Iraq. Because you didn't get to go to university if you didn't know someone, or if you didn't pay a local official, or you weren't a Ba'ath Party member. So we look at the way the society is structured and we think, you know, we can't trust this guy because everyone that comes into contact is reliant on someone who's reliant on someone who's reliant on someone. We have this idea of clientelism going on here. So even when we're busy trying to interact via hand splits and the weapons inspectors and all that kind of fun stuff, what fundamentally happens is that we don't actually trust what we see. And then we come to 1441. And 1441 is our primary and operative UN resolution here. Because what it's saying is, comply or else. Give up the WMDs, prove you've given up the WMDs. If you can't prove you've given up the WMDs, we're coming for you, but importantly, what it doesn't do is say what we can do when we come for you. That bit's left open-ended, undefined. And this is actually really interesting because, of course, this is the piece of legislation that we all go running back to justify Operation Iraqi Freedom. You didn't comply. We know you didn't comply. We have a dossier of information that says you didn't comply. By the way, you're a really bad man. We're going to come for you anyway. But here's the basis. Also, I would suggest you bear this in mind when we come on to the next slide. Because here's the thing. We now also, in the post-1994, 1995 world, we have this swirling idea of humanitarianism and intervention as being important and a just cause to go to war. 22nd of April 1999, Tony Blair pitched up into Chicago at a summit and he gave a little speech. And whilst a lot of it was platitudes and yeah, we love Chicago, you're great. Unfortunately, or fortunately for some, what he also spelled out was you know something, if we don't like you and we don't like what you're doing to your people, we will come for you. And this, of course, has a direct effect, or a direct impact, on the way we view Iraq. Because, of course, one of the things that we do in the aftermath of the Kuwait invasion is we establish no-fly zones over the north and south in order to protect the Marsh Arabs in the south and the Kurds in the north. Why we're protecting the Kurds will become clear later on. So Blair is very much interested in humanitarianism. Blair is very keen that we should be able to enforce our liberal values via means of force. You may have come up against this in your reading. This, of course, is done in the context of Kosovo, where we used force to protect from a genocide. And it argues on a just war premise, from the just war tradition, that we have right intent, as in we're fighting in defense of ourselves or others, the war is declared by a competent authority, so a government, that we have a probability of success, that it's the absolute last thing we can do. What we do is proportional, and that any harm suffered by the side we go up against is absolutely justified by the harm being caused to the side we're defending. Those are basically, that's the Cliff's Notes of the just war theory. And so in Kosovo we articulate this argument and we say humanitarianism is great because we can save people. And we see some of the same language emerging, I would suggest, when we're dealing with Iraq. Because Saddam is a bad man, as we've managed to prove in this room. Only 12 of you would go to university. That there's not much electricity. That he's busy cheating on oil for food. He's living a life of luxury, whilst his people, some of his people, are quite literally in the gutter. And Kosovo allowed us to articulate this idea of interest based on value rather than interest based on pure interest. That said, of course, there is always going to be this kind of confluence. But what it is, it's an acknowledgement of globalization, and it's an acknowledgement of the independence that we see and the reliance that we have on having something resembling common values. And that there are extended costs to this. And in this speech, he name-checks Saddam. So it shouldn't come as an enormous surprise that he's going to become of more interest to us later. Now this speech kind of foretells the second one here, the National Security Strategy in 2002. Now this is of course issued in full knowledge and full understanding, we think, of the World Trade Center. The World Trade Center is the key event, because what it does is it kind of indicates to people that bad things exist in the world and they can breed in bad places. Now, the National Security Strategy is very interesting, of course, because what it does is it articulates, for example, a commitment to foreign aid. It absolutely demands an expansion of global economies. To use the language of the marriage counsellor, states that trade together, stay together. It's a liberal policy. And it also introduces the idea of a Bush doctrine, that there is unilateral action in defence is pretty much totally acceptable. That an attack on a terrorist safe haven is, again, utterly acceptable from the position of the United States of America. That preemption, a preemptive attack, is again justifiable. And whoever's got the phone, switch it off. Please. And it also encourages democratic regime change. So what we've got here is a checklist. Done? Thank you. So fundamentally, this is a liberal policy document, I would suggest, because it articulates liberal values. It encourages... There is a power switch. That's fine. So this is a liberal document. This is a liberal policy, essentially, because it's encouraging trade. It's saying states that trade together stay together. It's interested in aid. But it's also a very neoconservative policy document. And this is where we begin to see these guys. Because, of course, neoconservatives love trade. They adore democracy, particularly American democracy, but others are okay. And they're also interested in stability. I was talking about this with a friend last night. We pretty much came up with a definition. And a neocon, a neoconservative, is essentially a liberal. However, I mean, this isn't a liberal with an evangelical streak, a faint disregard for consequences, and access to heavy weapons. This is muscular liberalism. This is armoured liberalism. This is liberalism and democracy that's saying you will be democratic, Otherwise we'll come for you. And so there is definitely an ideological purpose behind it. And Friedman picks up on this. Because what he does is he gives us this idea that there is such a thing as a liberal war. And, as we saw in Kosovo, Kosovo is a liberal war, and Iraq is a liberal war. This is a war for values. This is a war for truth, democracy, peace, good economics, good governance, stability, and general happiness. Because these are all good things. And these are all the product of our politics. And our politics is basically a negotiation of the good life. And since we've come to these goods, then it must absolutely be good to proselytize these goods. There's something faintly Fukuyama-ish in it. We've achieved the end of history. If history is the progress of human society. And so Friedman posits this idea of the liberal war. And it looks like Iraq is a liberal war because it's for all the good things, right? However, some of us kind of reject Larry's position. Because you can go to war for your values even if you're not a liberal. We might call these small wars. We might call these wars of value. We can call them certainly wars of choice. But calling them liberal wars, I think, is possibly, irony of ironies, a bit illiberal. Because we have other people who have other ideas of what the good life is. And they may be absolutely willing to fight for them. But it brings us back to Clausewitz. But perhaps not in the way he first thought, because war and politics. Politics and war, inextricably linked. Therefore, muscular politics becomes war. It must be. It's almost a self-fulfilling prophecy. But how does this help us? Because, of course, there are other people as well. Larry does not have the grip on the theory. And this is what we're talking about here. We need to get a grip on the theory. And, of course, as you are all good IR scholars, you will recognise that the realists are going to turn up. And they have all these things on their mind. They have their regional interests, they have instability, they have a certain number of realist interests at stake in the Gulf. Saddam is an instability. We don't trust him, remember? We don't trust him about WMDs. But here's the thing. We really, really, really don't want them getting out. And finally, we have Saudi Arabia. Now let's think about this from our position from the end of the last war. We have Saudi Arabia, which has got its own concerns. If you look at the communique from Al-Qaeda, one of the complaints against the United States is stationing troops in Saudi. If anyone's going to understand the problems of a revolutionary message about stationing troops among our people, it's the Americans. If you look at Saudi demography with its large number of underemployed young men who are bored and slightly pissed off at the world, then you can see why Saudi may want the Americans to leave. But of course the Americans come, and we might come on to that. But what we end up with is a very Jominian war. This is something which is absolutely atypical of the way the Americans go to war. A large build-up of forces, a boatload of technology, and shock and awe. Rapid domination. The use of a simply enormous amount of air-based force to essentially knock the stuffing out of the enemy so that the hilt of the blade can be pushed all the way in. It is combined arms, big war tactics across large, flat, open ground. Iraq cannot cope. It's been weakened by a decade of sanctions. Its troops are poorly trained. Its equipment is in shit order. There is nothing it can do. This becomes a remarkably quick war. And we can see quite how Jominian this war is. The bulk of the forces start here, down on the bottom right-hand side, in Kuwait. And what we can see is an almost classic, almost Napoleonic method of deploying your armies. Long, fast columns heading to the enemy's centre of gravity to neutralise him. Just to prove how quick this was, the go order was given on March the 20th. By April 9th, Baghdad has fallen. 20 days. By April 13th, Tikrit, which is where it's Saddam's hometown, is the source of his power. Right smack bang in that red triangle there. That's it. It is essentially over. America is in control of Iraq. It is an astonishing military victory. May 1st, so since the go order on March 20th, what? 40 days? Something like that? George Bush turns up on USS Abraham Lincoln and declares the end of major combat operations. In an interesting aside, USS Abraham Lincoln's nickname in the United States Navy is the Black Pearl. Anyone who wishes to make any kind of reference to piracy, be my guest. But there are problems. By April 12th, looting is reported. There are reports of a wholesale sacking of the Iraqi museum. However, unfortunately, happily, only 15,000 items go missing. But the cultural protections aren't there. And if you look at the laws of war, for example, we're actually compelled to protect cultural heritage. And we didn't. Interestingly, whilst every other government building is being looted because of the collapse in law and order, the police stay home, the oil ministry is guarded. There are a number of reasons for this. Of course, we might be because actually we kind of want the oil ministry to stay up so that Iraq can afford to pay its way in the future. Cynics may disagree. That's not for me to judge. But infrastructure is collapsing. The police are nowhere to be seen. All of a sudden, the invaders are stuck in a very different role. But how can we actually account for how this comes to pass? Because we've mentioned liberalism, we've mentioned realism, and of course it wouldn't be me if I didn't try and electrify the corpse of a long dead idea and say, let's have a look at some game theory. There's a game called Assurance. It's usually played when you're trying to work out whether you should build nuclear weapons or not. And all game theory is, it's a way of just figuring out on a piece of paper what the most likely outcomes for a particular situation are. Any economists among you will have heard of the prisoner's dilemma. But we can also have a look at something like Assurance. And what assurance tells us is that if you do, now we've got time. If you do the table, can we all see that? Is that big enough? It shows us that there is actually, we can game out the payoff matrix. We can see what happens if we go to war or not. If we maintain the conflict as it stood, actually both sides win. We contain them, they keep us bound up, but they're not going to attack us. If we withdraw, the payoff goes to Iraq. And this perhaps indicates why we may have changed our minds when Saudi started getting perhaps a little bit antsy. Because, of course, if we withdraw, Iraq gets the payoff, because it maintains its regional status. It also sent a superpower scuttling back to its shores, which is politically unacceptable. If Iraq withdraws, of course, there is no payoff for Iraq whatsoever. We win. Great. If we both withdraw on negotiated peace terms, that's great, because we all win. But of course, we have to remember the political realities of the situation, and in particular, the political realities that have emerged in the decade prior to the war. And I would suggest that whilst we look at this, the World Trade Center and the subsequent events changed the game. Because we were playing a multiple-turn game. This is just one instance. But the thing is with games is that they carry on, particularly in this environment. And because we have these games, and because we remember what happened in the last term, we make decisions based on the expected pattern behavior of our opponent. And here's the thing. We also knew that he was a very, very bad man. Who here's heard of Halabja? Halabja was a town in northern Iraq. Is a town in northern Iraq. In the 1980s, Saddam Hussein dropped gas weapons on Halabja, killing 5,000. I thought long and hard about this because I have a reputation, I know, of showing you truly dreadful things. I won't show you pictures from Halabja. If you wish to see them, you can find them on Google. And I'll tell you now that I will extend my office hours tomorrow until at least 4 p.m. so that if you do that and you have questions, or you just want to shout at someone for pointing it out to you, I will be there. But here's the thing. We knew he was a bad man. The turns had already been taken. The only thing we could do was change the game. The World Trade Center changed the game, both politically, emotionally, and it became a game of chicken. And there's only one way to win at chicken, and that's throw the steering wheel out of the car and make our opponent flinch. He didn't. And we just steamrolled. But of course, talking about multiple turn games and how we interact with states brings us to the ideas of Alexander Wendt and constructivism, of course. Because our interstate relations are shaped and formed by the relationships that we have with states that go in the past. We can also say, hey, this is a realist war. Because it was for interest. Absolutely, it was for interest. We had direct interests, both nationally and internationally, and particularly regionally, to be able to deal with this. Was this a liberal war? Was this a war founded in liberalism? Admittedly, I think even if we're being generous, we're going to have to say a certain amount of muscular liberalism, but I'm not convinced that it is, as Larry would call it, a liberal war. To extend the joys of representative democracy and free market economics at the point of a gun seems to perhaps be a little hypocritical. However, that said, it may easily be argued to be a humanitarian war, if not perhaps a liberal one, because of the suffering of the South and the suffering of the North, and also the considered and extended uncertainty which Saddam Hussein and Iraq presented to both the region and the international community, not least his neighbours. He'd already had, shall we call it, an unfortunate interaction with Iran during the 80s, and he'd also invaded Kuwait. This was, again, not a man that could be trusted. So there we go. How do we explain the Iraq War? Well, I'm not going to pretend to be able to tell you all the possible ways of thinking about the Iraq War in the space of an hour. Entire careers have and will be devoted to this. Whether or not we find what's up on the board here to be convincing, that's not for me to say. My job is necessarily to point out perhaps some of the interesting wrinkles and some different ways of thinking about it. You will note, for example, I haven't said much about, for example, oil conspiracies. I think fundamentally we can suggest that that perhaps doesn't stack up. We might look at the Saudi question. If we could find information on it, that would be great. Anecdotally, I know that force planners for the Royal Air Force and the United States found it incredibly difficult to get space for their aeroplanes at Saudi bases in the run-up to the Second Gulf War. I'll never be able to prove it. An anecdote is not data, but it lends grist to the mill. We can look at it from the realist perspective, of course. We can look at it from the constructivist perspective. We can even try and shoehorn it into the liberal dynamic. But that's not for me to do. This is why we give you guys reading. In the spirit of openness and transparency, and also giving away a little secret, ladies and gentlemen, that was my first ever lecture. We've got about 5 or so minutes. If you have any questions, I'll be happy to take them. Have I stunned you all into silence? It's terrible. And I know what you guys are like in the bus queue. Be nice. Ciao, bye.